The last time the sky did what it is doing right now, a nation starved. Not a village, not a province, a nation. Tens of millions of people, gone in a few short years, and almost no one alive today remembers why. It was not a war. It was not a plague. It was the atmosphere itself, quietly rearranging, exactly the way it is rearranging again tonight. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it does not sound possible. We are taught that famine is a human failure. Bad governments, bad harvests, bad luck, and sometimes it is. But the largest mass death events in the last 2 centuries did not begin in a field, or a palace, or a battlefield. They began here, in the temperature of the water you're looking at. They began in the ocean, rose into the air, and came down on 3 continents at once as silence. No rain, no warning, no mercy. The event has a name now, though the people who died in it never knew that name. We call it a strong El Niño, and in the late 1800s, one of them broke the weather for a third of the human species. Here is the part that should stop you. The specific configuration of ocean heat and atmospheric pressure that made that catastrophe possible is not a historical artifact. It is not sealed away in the past. It is a repeating pattern, a switch that the planet flips every few decades, and the instruments that watch that switch have been lighting up for months. So tonight we're going to do something the news cycle will not do. We're going to follow the heat. We will start at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, where this all begins, and we will trace it upward, into the winds, into the jet streams, into the monsoons that feed billions of people. We will walk into the year the rain stopped and meet the nation that starved, and then we will come back to the present, to the ocean as it stands right now, and we will ask the only question that actually matters. Is it happening again? Take your time with this one. There is no rush. Get comfortable. Because to understand what is coming, you have to understand what already came, and almost everyone has forgotten it. Let me be precise about what this video is, and what it is not. This is not a prediction that the world ends this year. I am not going to tell you a date. Anyone who gives you a date is selling you something. What I am going to give you instead is a mechanism, the actual physical machinery that connects a warm patch of ocean to an empty grain silo half a world away. Once you understand the machine, you will never look at a weather forecast the same way again. You will see the gears turning underneath it. Here is why this matters. Almost everything you've been told about extreme weather treats each event as its own separate story. A drought here, a flood there, a failed harvest somewhere else. The news reports them one at a time, on different nights, as if they were strangers to each other. They are not strangers. Very often they are the same event, wearing different masks in different countries, driven by a single shift in a single ocean. That single shift is the thing we are tracking tonight. And the reason this is urgent, the reason I am making this now and not as a history lesson 5 years from now, is that the ocean is not the same ocean it was in the 1800s. It is not even the same ocean it was in 1997, the last time a truly monstrous El Niño formed. The baseline has moved. The water is warmer to begin with, which means the same switch thrown today does not throw into the same world. It throws into a hotter, tighter, more loaded system. The gun is the same, the powder is different. So here is the path. First, the ocean. How the Pacific quietly stores an almost unimaginable amount of heat, and how it lets that heat go. Then the sky. How that released heat hijacks the winds and reroutes the rain for half the planet. Then the memory, the forgotten famines of the late 1800s, the nation that starved, and why history erased it. Then the present, how today's ocean compares, line by line, to the ocean that killed. And finally, the choice. Because unlike the people in 1876, we can see this coming. The only question is what we do with the warning. Stay with me. This is going to be a long one, and it is meant to be. Let it play. To understand any of this, you have to start with a number that does not fit inside a human head. The Pacific Ocean holds more than 90% of the excess heat that our planet has trapped over the last century. Not the atmosphere, not the land, the ocean. The air gets all the attention because the air is where we live, but the air is thin and it forgets heat quickly. Water does not. Water is a vault, and the Pacific is the largest vault on Earth. Think of it like this. Imagine a bathtub the size of a hemisphere, filled not with still water but with water that is constantly being pushed. The thing doing the pushing is wind, specifically the trade winds, the steady easterly winds that blow across the tropical Pacific from the Americas toward Asia. Day after day, year after year, those winds drag the warm surface water westward, piling it up on the far side of the ocean, near Indonesia and the Philippines. They pile it so high and so warm that the sea level near Asia sits measurably higher than the sea level near South America. A warm mountain of water held in place by nothing but wind. Underneath that warm mountain, on the eastern side near South America, cold deep water rises up to take its place. This is the ocean's resting state. Scientists call it the neutral phase, or in its cool extreme, La Niña. Warm water pinned in the west, cold water surfacing in the east, the winds holding the whole arrangement together like a hand pressing down on a spring. Now, what happens when the hand lets go? That is El Niño. In an El Niño, the trade winds weaken, and sometimes they collapse entirely. Occasionally they even reverse, and the moment they stop pushing, the warm mountain of water that was piled up in the west is released. It sloshes back eastward across the entire width of the Pacific. Thousands of miles of warm water flooding toward the Americas, spreading across the surface of the ocean like warm oil across a cold pan. Let that sink in for a second. An area of ocean larger than every continent combined suddenly changes temperature. And warm water does not just sit there quietly. Warm water evaporates. Warm water feeds storms. Warm water changes the pressure of the air above it. When you heat the surface of the largest ocean on the planet, you are not adjusting a thermostat. You are lighting a fire under the engine that drives global weather. Here is the analogy I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video, because everything else depends on it. Think of the global atmosphere as a single enormous soundboard in a recording studio. Hundreds of sliders, each one controlling the rainfall or the temperature of a different region of the world. Most of the time, those sliders sit in their normal positions, and the weather behaves the way the farmers in the cities expect it to. An El Niño walks into that studio and shoves one master fader all the way up, and because every slider on the board is secretly wired to that one master fader, the entire mix changes at once. Rain that was supposed to fall in India falls into the empty ocean instead. Rain that never falls on the coast of Peru suddenly floods it. Australia dries out, East Africa drowns. The American South and West swing between extremes. One ocean, one shift, a rewired planet, and none of the people living under those sliders can see the hand on the fader. They only see their own weather changing in their own sky, and they assume it is a local accident. It is not a local accident. It is a global event, and it has a single cause, and that cause is sitting in the water right now. We measure the heat in that water in a unit most people have never heard of, the zettajoule. A single zettajoule is 1 billion trillion joules of energy. The ocean's heat content is now rising by multiple zettajoules every year, and the totals involved are so large they stop meaning anything, so forget the unit. Here is the translation. The Pacific today is holding more usable heat, closer to the surface, ready to be released than at almost any point in the instrumental record. The vault is fuller than it has ever been, and the question is not whether the door opens. The question is what pours out when it does. Because the ocean is only the first half of the machine, the heat has to go somewhere, and where it goes is up. When warm water spreads across the surface of the ocean, it does not stay water for long, it becomes air. Heat drives evaporation, and evaporation lifts enormous volumes of warm, wet air upward into the atmosphere. Over a strong El Niño, you get towering columns of rising air in places that are normally calm and dry, and where air rises in one part of the planet, it must sink somewhere else, because the atmosphere is a closed loop. Air is not created or destroyed, it circulates. So the moment El Niño lifts a wall of wet air over the central Pacific, it forces air to sink, dry, rainless, descending air, over regions thousands of miles away that were counting on rain. This is the mechanism that kills. Not the flooding, though the flooding is real. The killing is done by the sinking air, by the rain that simply does not arrive. Think of the atmosphere as a seesaw. Push one end down and the other end rises, always, automatically, without exception. When El Niño pushes wet, rising air up over the Pacific, the far end of that atmospheric seesaw drops over South and Southeast Asia, and over that end of the seesaw sits the single most important weather event in the world for human survival, the monsoon. Here is a fact that does not get said plainly often enough. More than 1 billion people depend directly on the monsoon, not indirectly, not eventually, directly. The seasonal rains that sweep across India and much of Asia each year are not a pleasant feature of the climate. They are the difference between a full harvest and an empty one for a significant fraction of the entire human species. The monsoon is a clock. Farmers plant to it. Entire economies breathe in and out with it. And that clock is wired, physically, mechanically wired, to the temperature of the Pacific Ocean. When a strong El Niño takes hold, it does something specific and terrible to that clock. It weakens the monsoon. Sometimes it delays it, sometimes it shortens it. And in the worst cases, in the strongest events, it can cause the monsoon to partially fail, to arrive late, deliver a fraction of the expected rain, and leave early. To a city person, a weak monsoon sounds like an inconvenience, a drier than usual summer. To a farmer with no irrigation and no savings, a failed monsoon is not an inconvenience. It is the end of the year's food, and possibly the end of everything. And it does not stop at the monsoon. The same released ocean heat that weakens the Asian rains also reaches up and grabs the jet streams. The fast rivers of air that steer weather systems across the middle latitudes, including across North America. In an El Niño year, the jet stream over the United States tends to shift and strengthen in ways that reroute storms, load the southern states with moisture, and starve other regions of it. The American West and South can swing violently, flood and drought trading places sometimes within the same season. The signal is not identical every time, but the fingerprint is unmistakable to anyone watching the whole board instead of one slider. Let me be precise about what this means, because this is the heart of it. A strong El Niño does not cause one disaster. It causes correlated disasters. It reaches into multiple continents at the same time and pulls the rain out of several of them at once. Drought in India while drought grips northeastern Brazil, while drought settles over parts of Africa, not by coincidence, not as separate tragedies, but as a single atmospheric event expressing itself in different places on the same board. And here is why that correlation is the truly dangerous part. The modern world survives disaster by moving food. When one region's harvest fails, we ship in grain from a region where it did not. That is the entire architecture of global food security. The assumption that when one place goes hungry, another place has a surplus. A strong El Niño attacks that assumption directly. It does not fail one breadbasket. It stresses several of them in the same year. And when the surpluses shrink everywhere at once, the shipping lanes that were supposed to save you have nothing to carry. This is what happened in the late 1800s, not a local famine, a synchronized planet-scale failure of rain, striking every vulnerable region in the same window, feeding on the connections between them. The world had never fully understood that a single ocean could do that. In some ways, it still refuses to understand it. So let us go there. Let us go to the year the seesaw tipped and the sky went empty. Let us meet the nation that starved. But I need you to remember, as we walk into the past, that the machine you just learned about is not a machine from the past. It is running right now. Keep it in the back of your mind. We're coming back to it. In 1876, across a vast stretch of the planet, the rain simply did not come. To understand how enormous this was, you have to abandon the idea of a famine as a single country's tragedy. What began in the mid-1870s was not one famine. It was a chain of famines, ignited nearly simultaneously across India, across China, across Brazil, across parts of Africa and the Pacific, all of them lit by the same match. And that match was one of the most powerful El Niño events in recorded history. Start in India. The monsoon of 1876 arrived weak, and the following year it collapsed. Across the south and the interior, the sky held its rain. Fields that had been farmed for 1,000 years cracked and went to dust. The crops that depend on the monsoon, the food that hundreds of millions of people were counting on, did not grow. And a population with almost no reserve, no buffer, no second option, walked directly into starvation. The numbers from that period are difficult to state out loud. In India alone, the deaths from the famines of the late 1870s ran into the many millions. Estimates commonly range from around 5 million to well over 10 million, and some run higher. Whole districts emptied. Roads filled with people walking toward relief that, in most places, never adequately came. And this was not a poor, disconnected corner of the world going hungry in isolation. This was happening inside the largest empire on Earth, in a territory that was, at that very moment, exporting food. Let me be precise about what that means, because it is the part that turns a natural disaster into something worse. The drought was natural. The atmosphere did what the atmosphere does. But the death toll was not purely natural. During the worst of the starvation, grain was still being loaded onto ships and sent out of the country, because the market said it should be, and because policy at the time treated interference with that market as a greater sin than mass death. Relief was often deliberately kept minimal, on the theory that generosity would make the population dependent. People starved within sight of full granaries. They starved next to railway lines carrying food away from them. This is the pattern that repeats across every one of these events, and I want you to notice it now, because we are going to see it again when we return to the present. The atmosphere creates the shortage. Human systems decide who dies. The sky pulls the trigger. The choices made in the months around it decide where the bullet lands. Now go east to China. In the same window, in the late 1870s, northern China was struck by a drought of almost unimaginable severity. The rains that the northern provinces depended on failed for years in a row, and in a region of dense population and thin margins, the result was one of the deadliest famines in all of human history. The death toll in northern China during this period is estimated in the range of 9 to 13 million people, possibly more. Entire provinces were hollowed out. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that the human mind does not want to hold. And here is the thing that should make the hair stand up on your arms. India and China are separated by the Himalayas, the largest mountain range on the planet. Their weather systems are, on any ordinary day, effectively strangers to each other. And yet they starved in the same window for the same underlying reason, because both of them sit downwind of the same ocean, on the same atmospheric seesaw, wired to the same master fader that had just been shoved all the way up. Now cross the entire planet to Brazil. In the northeast of Brazil, a region called the Sertão, the same El Niño expressed itself as its own catastrophic drought. The rains failed there too, and the death toll in that single region ran into the hundreds of thousands, possibly beyond 500,000. A drought in Brazil, a famine in India, and a famine in China. 3 disasters on 3 continents, oceans apart, with nothing in common except the temperature of the Pacific. That is not a coincidence. That is a mechanism. That is the seesaw and the soundboard, operating at planetary scale, in real historical time, killing real people by the tens of millions. And then, before the world could even absorb what had happened, it happened again. Because these strong El Niño events do not come once, they repeat. And near the turn of the century, in the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, another powerful El Niño arrived and drove another wave of synchronized famine across many of the same regions. India again, China again, parts of Africa, more millions gone. When historians add up the death toll across these clustered late-century events, the famines of the 1870s and the famines of the 1890s together, the total climbs into the tens of millions. Some serious estimates place the combined toll across all affected regions in the range of 30 to 60 million human beings, 30 to 60 million people, killed in large part by the temperature of an ocean and the way the world chose to respond to it. That is more than the First World War. It is more than most of the pandemics we do remember. And here is the question that should be burning in your mind right now, the one that took me a long time to be able to answer. How is it possible that you have never heard of this? I want to slow down here before we leave the past and make this something other than a number. Because 30 to 60 million is a statistic, and the human mind cannot feel a statistic. It can only feel a scene. So let me put you inside one. Picture a farming village in the interior of the subcontinent in the second year of the drought. It is not dramatic. That is the first thing to understand. There is no wall of fire, no flood, no army on the horizon. There is only the sky, and the sky is the problem because the sky is empty. It has been empty for months. The season when the rains should have come has arrived and passed, and the clouds that the entire year is built around simply did not form. The fields that were planted in hope are cracked open, the soil curled and grey. The seed that went into the ground did not come back out of it. And here is the cruelty of a famine that begins in the sky. On the day the rain fails to arrive, nothing happens. The failure is an absence, and an absence makes no sound. There is no moment to react to, no siren, no shock. Just a growing quiet, a slow understanding that spreads through a community as the reserves run down and the market prices climb, and the food that was supposed to be there simply is not. First, the poorest feel it. Then, everyone. The village does not collapse in a day. It thins slowly over a year as people eat their seed grain because there is nothing else, and then have nothing to plant even if the rain returns, and then begin to walk toward a city, toward a relief camp, toward a rumour of food somewhere else, and many of them do not arrive. Now hold that scene, and remember what we established earlier. In the worst of it, in more than one of these events, food was moving the entire time. Grain sat in stores, ships carried it away toward markets that could pay. Railway cars rolled past the walking people, loaded with the exact thing that would have saved them, because the systems of the day had decided that the movement of the market mattered more than the lives in front of it. That is the detail that turns a natural disaster into a human one. The sky created the shortage, but no one had to die inside sight of full granaries. That part was a choice, made by people far away, in comfortable rooms, who experienced the whole catastrophe as a column of numbers rather than a village going quiet. Multiply that single village by hundreds of thousands of villages across the interior of one enormous country, and then do it again across northern China, and again across northeastern Brazil, all in the same handful of years, all driven by the same warm ocean, and you begin to feel the true scale of the thing, not as a statistic, as a silence spread across a third of the planet, a silence with a single cause, sitting thousands of miles away in the temperature of the water that not one of the people living through it could see. And that is the last thing I want you to carry out of the past and into the present. Those people were not foolish. They were not weak. They were not living in some primitive age that has nothing to teach us. They were ordinary human beings, going about ordinary lives, who happened to be standing downwind of an ocean that flipped a switch they had no way of knowing existed. The only thing that separated them from us, the only thing, is that they could not see it coming, and we can. Everything else about them, the hope in the planted field, the slow disbelief as the rain refused to fall, the instinct to trust that surely someone would help, that surely it would break, all of that is not history. All of that is simply human, and it is still in us, waiting, exactly the same as it was in them. There are a few reasons a catastrophe of this size can vanish from public memory, and they are worth understanding, because the same reasons are operating on us right now. The first reason is that the deaths happened far away from the people who write the histories. The famines of the late 1800s fell hardest on colonized and rural populations, people whose suffering was recorded in ledgers and administrative reports, rather than in the monuments and museums of the powerful. When millions die in a war, statues get built. When millions die quietly of hunger, in villages, over a slow year, the record is thin and easy to lose. The second reason is that a slow disaster does not feel like a disaster. This is one of the most important and least understood facts about how human beings perceive danger, so I want to slow down on it. Our brains are built to react to sudden, loud, visible threats. A flood that arrives in an hour terrifies us. A drought that arrives over 18 months barely registers, because on any given day nothing has visibly changed. The sky is still blue, the temperature is a little high, the reservoir is a little low, each individual day looks almost normal, and by the time the accumulated damage is undeniable, by the time the fields are dust and the granaries are empty, the moment for prevention is already years in the past. A famine is not an explosion. It is a fade. And human beings are very, very bad at reacting to a fade. The third reason is the one that matters most for tonight. At the time, nobody fully understood the cause. The people living through those famines did not know about El Niño. They did not know that a warm patch of ocean thousands of miles away had reached up and switched off their rain. They experienced it as a local misfortune, or as fate, or as punishment. The connecting thread, the single ocean event tying 3 continents together, was invisible to them. It would take most of a century of science to even name the pattern, and longer still to understand how it worked. So the memory that survived was fractured. India remembered an Indian famine. China remembered a Chinese famine. Brazil remembered a Brazilian drought. Nobody remembered the ocean, because nobody knew to look at the ocean, and that is the difference between them and us. That is the one advantage we hold that they did not. We can see it. We have satellites parked over the Pacific measuring the surface temperature of the water in near real time. We have a lattice of buoys strung across the equator, sending back the temperature of the water hundreds of feet below the surface, the exact reservoir of subsurface heat that determines how strong an El Niño will become. We have decades of records, models, and pattern matching that let us watch the switch in the moment it begins to flip. The people of 1876 were blindfolded. We are not. The blindfold is off, the instruments are on, the warning is available to anyone who chooses to look. Which raises the only question that actually matters. If we can see it, then they could not. Then why does it still feel like almost no one is talking about it? Hold that question. Because now we come back to the present. Now we come back to the ocean as it stands tonight, and we compare it, line by line, to the ocean that killed. So let us do the comparison honestly. Let us put the ocean of the 1870s next to the ocean of right now, and see how much of the old pattern is reassembling. The first thing to say is the thing that makes this different from a simple history lesson. The Pacific is once again tilting toward its warm phase. The trade winds have shown the weakening that precedes a strong event. Warm water has been sliding eastward across the equatorial Pacific, and the pool of subsurface heat, the fuel tank buried a few hundred feet down, has been running warm and deep. Forecast agencies have issued their advisories. The warm phase of the Pacific's master cycle is, once again, no longer a forecast. It is a developing reality. On its own, that would be worth watching. An El Niño is always worth watching. But that is not the part that should stop you. Here is the part that should stop you. The ocean. This is happening in is not the ocean of 1876. It is not even the ocean of 1997, the last time a truly monstrous El Niño formed. In the decades since, the baseline temperature of the entire planet has climbed. The oceans have absorbed the overwhelming majority of the extra heat, trapped by a thicker blanket of greenhouse gases, more than 90% of it. So when an El Niño arrives today and adds its own spike of warmth on top, it is not adding that spike to a neutral, cool, forgiving system. It is adding it to a system that is already running hot, already loaded, already closer to every dangerous threshold than it has ever been in the instrumental record. Let me give you the analogy, because this is the single most important idea in the entire video. Imagine a fever. A healthy body sits at a normal temperature, and a fever of 2 or 3 degrees is survivable. Uncomfortable, but survivable, because it starts from a safe baseline. Now imagine a body that is already running a low-grade fever all the time, every day, permanently. When that body catches the same illness and spikes the same 2 or 3 degrees, it does not climb to a survivable number. It climbs past the edge. Same illness, same spike. Completely different outcome because the baseline moved. That is what we have done to the Pacific. We have moved the baseline, and now the old switch, the same El Niño switch that emptied the sky over India and China in the 1870s, is being thrown into a hotter world. The trigger is the same. The system it triggers is not. This is where I need to say the words plainly, because everything in this video has been building to them. A warm baseline plus a strong El Niño is no longer just a warm year. It is a compounding event. The historical warm baseline is no longer a distant background condition. It is the current, verifiable physical foundation that every new El Niño now stacks on top of. And the atmosphere that the people of 1876 lived under, an atmosphere with more room, more margin, more forgiveness, that atmosphere no longer exists. We are living under a tighter one. And here is what that tighter atmosphere does to the specific mechanism we traced earlier. Remember the seesaw. Remember the monsoon on the far end of it. In a warmer world, the swings of that seesaw do not get gentler. They get sharper. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, roughly 7% more for every degree of warming, which means that when the rain does fall, it can fall harder and more destructively. And when the rain fails, the ground bakes faster and drier, because the thirsty air pulls moisture out of the soil more aggressively. The wet places can get wetter, and the dry places can get drier, both at once, from the same event. The extremes stretch in both directions. So the honest comparison is this. The pattern reassembling in the Pacific tonight is the same species of pattern that drove the great famines. But it is arriving into a world that is warmer, more crowded, more interconnected, and more dependent on a handful of major bread baskets than the world of 1876 ever was. The mechanism is old, the stage it is walking onto is new, and it is more fragile. I am not telling you a strong El Niño this cycle will kill tens of millions. I am not telling you that. The world of today has irrigation, satellites, global shipping, grain reserves, and warning systems that the world of 1876 could not dream of. Those defenses are real, and they matter, and they are the entire reason the outcome is not predetermined. What I am telling you is that the same gun is being loaded in a room that is now full of more people, and that the safety catch is not the ocean. The safety catch is us, our preparation, our reserves, our willingness to look at the warning while there is still time to act on it. And that brings us to the question you should actually be asking. Not will the sky empty over India again? The question is closer to home than that. The question is, what does this do to you? Here is the comforting story you have probably been told, maybe without anyone ever saying it out loud. Famine is something that happens in other places, in poor countries, in history books, in the developing world. It is a tragedy you donate to, not a thing that reaches your own kitchen. That story has kept a lot of people calm for a long time. I want you to set that story down, gently, and look at how the modern world actually feeds itself. Because when you understand the architecture, the comfort starts to come apart. The modern food system is not a collection of self-sufficient regions, each growing its own food. It is a single, tightly connected global network, and it runs on a very small number of very large bread baskets. A handful of regions on Earth grow the overwhelming majority of the grain that the entire planet eats and trades. The American Midwest, the plains of Canada, parts of South America, the Black Sea region, a few others. These are the load-bearing walls of global food, and everyone else, including wealthy countries that import a large share of what they eat, leans on those walls staying standing. Now recall what a strong El Niño does. It does not attack one region. It reaches across multiple continents and stresses several bread baskets in the same window. It can bring drought to one grain belt while flooding another and scorching a third. And because the whole system is connected, you do not need a total failure anywhere to feel it everywhere. You just need several regions to underperform at the same time. When that happens, the global surplus, the buffer that quietly protects all of us, shrinks. And when the buffer shrinks, prices do not rise politely, they spike. This is the part that reaches your kitchen. You are unlikely in a wealthy country to open your cupboard and find nothing. That is not the modern risk. The modern risk is subtler, and it is already familiar to you because you have lived through smaller versions of it. The risk is price. The risk is that the cost of the most basic foods, grain, cooking oil, coffee, sugar, the inputs that feed livestock and therefore the cost of meat and eggs and dairy, climbs steadily and then sharply as a single ocean event ripples through a dozen supply chains at once. You do not experience it as famine. You experience it as a grocery bill that keeps climbing for reasons the news explains one product at a time, never connecting them, never naming the ocean. And that is exactly the trap we talked about earlier. The correlated disaster, reported as a series of unrelated stories. A bad coffee harvest in one country, a poor wheat year in another. Rice export limits somewhere else. Each one gets its own headline on its own night, and almost no one stitches them together into the single event they often are. The connective thread, the ocean, stays invisible, just like it did in 1876. Only now, instead of causing mass death in distant fields, it shows up as a slow, grinding squeeze on the household budgets of the entire connected world. Now bring it closer still, to American soil specifically, because the United States is not just a consumer of this system. It is one of the load-bearing walls, and it has its own deep vulnerability that a strong El Niño can press on directly. Look at the American West, look at the water. A significant share of the fruit, vegetables and nuts grown in the United States comes from regions that depend on a water system already stretched to its limit. Reservoirs on the Colorado River system that have spent years sitting far below their historical levels. Aquifers being drawn down faster than they can refill. Mountain snowpack that a warmer atmosphere increasingly delivers as rain that runs off immediately instead of snow that melts slowly through the growing season. This is a system living paycheck to paycheck, hydrologically speaking. And a strong El Niño can swing that system hard in either direction. a season of destructive flooding that the dry, hardened ground cannot absorb, or a deepening of the drought that has already been grinding the region down for years. Here is the mechanism that makes drought worse, stated plainly, because it is not intuitive. When land has been baked dry for long enough, it stops behaving like soil and starts behaving like pavement. Healthy ground acts like a sponge. It soaks up rain and holds it. Land that has been in prolonged drought loses that ability, so when heavy rain finally does arrive, it does not soak in and refill the reserves. It sheets off the hardened surface all at once, causing flash floods on the way to the sea, and leaves the underground water no better off than before. The ground is no longer a sponge, it is a ramp. You can get the flood and the drought in the same year, from the same event, and end up with less usable water at the end of it than you started with. Put those pieces together, and the picture for an American viewer is not a distant historical famine. It is a domestic squeeze on water, on farmland, and on the grocery bill, arriving through a chain of events most people will never connect to a warm patch of the Pacific Ocean. You will feel the effects long before anyone tells you the cause, and by the time the cause is common knowledge, the season that produced it will already be over. That is the honest version of what it does to you. Not the end of the world, something quieter and more corrosive, a tightening, a rising cost, a thinning of the margins that a comfortable life quietly depends on. The 1876 version was catastrophic because the margins were non-existent. The modern version is dangerous because the margins are thinner than almost anyone realizes, and because the system that protects us is more connected and therefore more able to transmit a shock from one side of the planet to the other than it has ever been. If you think the United States is somehow exempt from this, too modern, too wealthy, too advanced to be humbled by the sky, I want to remind you of something that happened inside living memory on American soil and that most people have quietly filed away as an old photograph rather than a warning. The Dust Bowl. In the 1930s, across the Great Plains, a combination of drought and disturbed soil turned one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world into a wasteland. The rains failed. The topsoil, stripped of the deep-rooted native grasses that had held it in place for millennia, simply lifted into the air. Storms of dust rolled across entire states, black walls of soil thousands of feet high that turned midday into midnight. Farms that had been thriving a few years earlier were buried. Families who had believed the land would always provide loaded what they could carry and left, hundreds of thousands of them, in one of the largest internal migrations in American history. That was not a distant country. That was the American heartland. And notice the shape of it, because it is the same shape we have been tracing all night. It did not arrive as a single catastrophe. It arrived as a fade, a few dry years that each looked survivable, a slow erosion of the margin, until suddenly the margin was gone and the soil was in the sky. The people living through the early part of it did not know they were living through the beginning of a historic disaster. They thought it was a bad stretch, a run of dry luck that would break. It did not break in time, and the reason I raise it is not to frighten you with the past. It is to break the spell of exemption. The comfortable assumption that a rich modern society cannot be brought to its knees by the weather is not supported by that society's own history. It happened here, it happened recently. And the conditions that made the land so vulnerable then, soil pushed to its limit, water drawn down past what could be replaced, a system running with no margin for a bad year, are not gone. In some regions of the American West, they are more true today than they were then. Here is the uncomfortable synthesis. In 1876, the vulnerable populations had no reserves, no science, and no warning, and tens of millions died. In the 1930s, America had more of all three, and still an entire region collapsed and emptied. Today we have far more science and warning than either, the best early detection system for these ocean shifts that has ever existed. The open question, the only one that has ever mattered, is whether having the warning is the same thing as heeding it. Because a warning that no one acts on is not really a warning. It is just a well-documented surprise. So we arrive at the strangest part of this entire story. We can see the ocean, we can measure the switch, we understand the mechanism in detail that the people of 1876 would have considered sorcery. And still, somehow, the warning slides off the surface of public attention like water off glass. Why? The answer is not stupidity, and it is not a conspiracy. The answer is built into the way human minds work and into the way our information system is shaped. And I think it is worth understanding, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and you become one of the small number of people who is actually watching. The first reason is the fade problem we already named, and it is worth repeating because it is the deepest one. Human attention is tuned for the sudden and the loud, and El Niño is neither. It builds over many months. On any single day, nothing dramatic happens. The ocean is a fraction of a degree warmer than it was last week. The forecast has shifted slightly. There is no single moment of catastrophe to point a camera at, no explosion, no wave, no collapse you can capture in 15 seconds. And a threat with no dramatic moment is, for our media environment, almost invisible, because our media environment is built to capture and sell dramatic moments. A slow, planetary, months-long reorganization of the atmosphere is the single hardest kind of story to make anyone feel. So it doesn't get made, not because it isn't important, because it isn't loud. The second reason is complexity. To actually understand why a warm patch of ocean should make you check your pantry, you have to follow a chain: ocean heat, to trade winds, to atmospheric circulation, to monsoon, to global harvests, to shipping, to price, to your grocery bill. That is a lot of links. Each one is understandable, but the chain as a whole takes patience to hold in your head. And a threat you have to concentrate for 20 minutes to understand will always lose the competition for attention against a threat you can grasp in a single glance. The danger is real, but it is inconvenient to explain, and so it goes unexplained. The third reason is the most human of all. We do not want it to be true. There is a deep, understandable pull toward the comforting version. It's just a bad year. It'll break. It always breaks. Someone would tell us if it was serious. That instinct is not foolish. It has gotten our species through a lot of frightening nights, but it has also, repeatedly, walked entire societies straight into disasters that were visible in advance. The people of 1876 did not have the option to look away, because they could not see it coming at all. We have the harder burden. We can see it, which means looking away is a choice. And this is where I want to gently challenge the comforting story one more time. Every time in history that this pattern has fully assembled, someone, somewhere, had enough information to say, this looks like the last time. The signals were there. The comparison was available. What was missing was not data. What was missing was the collective will to treat a quiet warning as seriously as a loud one. That is the gap that kills. Not ignorance, denial. The specific, comfortable denial of a danger that does not yet look dangerous. You are not in that denial right now. You are here, an hour deep into a video about the exact mechanism, which means you are already doing the rarest thing. You are looking at the fade while it is still a fade, while there is still time for looking to matter. Let us leave the history and the psychology behind for a moment and get concrete. If you wanted to watch this the way the scientists watch it, if you wanted to see the switch with your own eyes instead of taking anyone's word for it, here is what you would actually look at. Because the beauty and the terror of the modern age is that all of this is measurable, in near real time, and most of it is public. The first thing they watch is a stretch of the equatorial Pacific that researchers have divided into regions and numbered. The most important one sits in the central and eastern part of the ocean, and its surface temperature is tracked continuously. When the water there runs a certain amount above its long-term average for long enough, that is the formal definition of an El Niño. It is not a vibe, it is not a guess. It is a specific ocean region crossing a specific temperature threshold and staying there. When you hear that an advisory has been issued, that is what has happened. The water crossed the line and stayed across it. The second thing they watch is the part almost no one talks about, and it is the one that actually determines how strong the event becomes. It is the subsurface. A few hundred feet below the surface of the Western Pacific, there is a reservoir of warm water, the fuel tank. Before a big El Niño, that subsurface warmth builds and then begins to slide eastward along the equator, like a slow wave moving beneath the surface, invisible from above. That subsurface wave is the loaded chamber. When forecasters see a large warm subsurface anomaly propagating east, they know the surface has fuel to draw on for months. A shallow, weak subsurface signal means the event may fizzle. A deep, broad, warm one means it has room to grow into something serious. That is the single most important number that never makes the news. The third thing they watch is the wind, specifically the trade winds and their occasional bursts of reversal, westerly wind bursts that punch the warm water eastward and can kick a developing event into a higher gear. Each burst is like another shove on the fader. A season with repeated westerly bursts over the Western Pacific is a season where the machine is being actively wound up. And the fourth thing they watch is the atmosphere's response, whether the sky is actually coupling to the warm ocean, whether the rising and sinking air, the pressure seesaw, is locking into the El Niño configuration. Because an ocean can warm without the atmosphere fully responding, and it is the coupling of the two, ocean and sky moving together, that turns a warm patch of water into a planet-scale weather event. When the ocean warms and the atmosphere locks onto it, the machine is fully engaged. Here is why I am walking you through this. When you know these four things, the surface temperature, the subsurface fuel, the wind bursts and the atmospheric coupling, you stop being a passive consumer of scary headlines, and you become someone who can actually read the situation. You can watch the fuel tank fill. You can watch the coupling engage. You can see in advance whether this is shaping up to be a minor warm year or something with the structure of the events that emptied the sky in the past. And the timeline matters because these events have a rhythm. They typically build through one part of the year and reach their peak strength months later, usually in the boreal winter, which means there is almost always a window, a stretch of months between the moment the pattern becomes clear and the moment it reaches full strength. That window is the entire ball game. It is the difference between the people of 1876, who had no window because they had no warning, and us who are handed months of lead time by our instruments. The question, always, is what gets done inside the window. Reserves, built or not built. Water managed or wasted. Supply chains braced or left exposed. Households prepared or caught flat-footed. The forecast is the easy part. It practically arrives on schedule now. The preparation, that is the part that is still entirely a choice. The ocean has already made its move. The only variable still fully in human hands is what happens in the months between now and the peak. I have spent most of this video showing you the loaded gun. Now let me do the thing that separates an honest analysis from a doom pitch and show you the other side of the ledger, because it is real and you deserve the whole picture, not just the frightening half of it. The first honest point is that not every El Niño becomes a monster. Most do not. The Pacific tilts warm fairly regularly, and the majority of those events are moderate, disruptive to weather patterns, meaningful for farmers and forecasters, but nowhere near the scale of the catastrophic events we walk through tonight. The mere presence of an advisory does not mean a historic disaster is coming. It means the machine has started. How far it runs depends on the fuel, the winds, and the coupling. The very things we just learned to watch. So when someone tells you an El Niño is developing, the correct response is not panic. It is attention. Those are different things, and the difference is the whole point of this channel. The second honest point is that the world of today is genuinely, enormously more capable than the world of 1876. We have irrigation on a scale the 19th century could not imagine. We have global grain reserves. We have shipping networks that can move food across oceans in days. We have weather forecasting that turns a blindfolded stumble into a lit path. We have, in most wealthy nations, social systems designed to prevent outright starvation. Every one of those defenses is real. Every one of them is a reason the worst outcome is not destiny. The people of 1876 had almost none of them. We have all of them. That matters, and it would be dishonest to hide it from you. And the third honest point is the one about attribution, because I want to be careful with your trust. The connection between the Pacific and global weather is well established and not controversial. It is one of the most studied relationships in all of climate science. But the exact strength of any single upcoming event, the precise regions it will hit hardest, and the specific size of its effect on any one harvest, those are forecasts, not certainties. The mechanism is solid. The specifics carry uncertainty. Anyone who tells you they know exactly how this cycle plays out, down to the region and the month, is claiming a precision that does not exist. I am not going to insult you with that. What I am giving you is the pattern, the history, the mechanism, and the current state of the ocean. What you do with that is yours. So hold both halves at once. The gun is loaded, that part is true, and the baseline really has moved, and the system really is more fragile and more connected than it was, and the defenses are real. That part is also true, and the outcome really is not written yet. Both. Not one comforting half, not one terrifying half. Both. Together, honestly. That is the only intellectually honest place to stand, and from that place, the correct posture is not despair, and it is not denial. It is the quiet, unglamorous readiness of someone who has looked at the warning and decided to take it seriously while there is still time. I am not going to give you a shopping list or a panic plan, because that is not what this channel is for, and because fear is a terrible advisor. But I do want to talk calmly about what it looks like to actually take a slow warning seriously, because the whole tragedy of the Fade is that people wait for a dramatic moment to act, and the dramatic moment for this kind of threat never comes until it is too late. The people who come through these events best are almost never the ones who reacted in a panic at the end. They are the ones who made small, unglamorous adjustments early during the window when nothing looked urgent yet. That is the entire lesson of every one of these disasters, from 1876 to the Dust Bowl to now. The margin is built quietly, in advance, by people who took a fade seriously before it became a cliff. What does that actually mean, in practical, calm terms? It means understanding where your own food and water actually come from, so that a disruption somewhere in the chain is something you can see coming rather than something that ambushes you at the register. It means a modest buffer, a little more resilience in the pantry, a little more slack in the household budget, a little less dependence on everything arriving perfectly on time from the other side of the planet. Not a bunker, not fear, just margin. The thing the people of 1876 did not have, and the thing the modern world has quietly trained us to live without. And it means something even simpler than that. It means paying attention to the fade. It means being the person in your circle who noticed the ocean warming, while everyone else was waiting for a headline dramatic enough to make them care. You cannot control the Pacific. You cannot throw the switch back, but you can refuse to be surprised. You can refuse to be one of the people who, a year from now, asks how come nobody told us, when the instruments were telling anyone who chose to listen the whole time. That is the entire posture, not fear, awareness, not panic, margin. The calm, deliberate readiness of someone who has read the history and decided not to repeat it. Let me pull the camera all the way back now, out past the ocean, and show you the whole board at once, the way the pattern expresses itself across the planet when it fully engages. Because the danger, remember, was never one region. The danger was always the correlation. So walk the board with me. Start again over the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia. When a strong El Niño locks in, this is the region that tends toward drought. The rising branch of air relocates east, and the monsoon that this part of the world lives and dies by is put at risk of weakening or arriving late. Indonesia, parts of Australia, the Philippines. Historically, these are the places where a strong warm event turns the taps down. And a dry Southeast Asia is not a small thing. It affects the production of staple crops and commodities that feed into supply chains the whole world touches. Move west to the Indian subcontinent. This is the seesaw's most consequential seat because of sheer human numbers. A weakened or erratic monsoon here does not stay a local story. It ripples into the food security of well over 1 billion people and into global markets for the crops grown across the region. When forecasters watch an El Niño develop, the health of the coming monsoon is one of the first things they worry about, precisely because history has shown, again and again, how tightly the two are bound. Now swing to the Americas. Along the western coast of South America, a strong El Niño often does the opposite of drought. It can bring devastating rain and flooding to normally arid coasts, as the warm water fuels storms that dump on places with no infrastructure to handle them. And it disrupts the ocean's biology, warming waters that cold water fisheries depend on, striking at the food and the economy of entire coastal nations. Meanwhile, across the northeast of Brazil, the same event historically leans toward drought. The same drought that, in the 1870s, killed hundreds of thousands there. Come north to the United States. Here the signal is more complex, as we discussed, but real, a tendency to reroute storm tracks, to load certain regions with moisture while starving others, to push the already stressed water systems of the West toward one extreme or the other, and to do all of it on top of a warmer baseline that stretches every swing wider than it used to be. And look at the temperature of the planet as a whole. Strong El Niño years tend to be global temperature record years because the event releases a surge of ocean heat into the atmosphere, temporarily spiking the whole planet's average on top of the long-term climb. So a strong event does not just rearrange the rain, it briefly turns the global thermostat up, and every heat-sensitive system on Earth feels it at once. Now put it all together in one frame, the way almost no news broadcast ever will. Drought risk over Southeast Asia, monsoon risk over the subcontinent, flood risk on one South American coast, drought risk on another, scrambled storm tracks and stressed water over North America, a spike in the global average temperature, all of it at the same time radiating outward from a single warm anomaly in a single ocean. One cause, a dozen consequences on every inhabited continent in the same window. That is the shape of the thing. That is what the people of 1876 lived through without ever being able to see it whole. And it is the thing that is beginning to assemble again, in the water, right now, while most of the world looks at each piece of it separately and never once looks at the ocean underneath. There is one more thing about these events that I have been holding back until now, because it only lands correctly once you understand everything else. And it is, in some ways, the most unsettling piece of the whole picture. These events do not come once and vanish. They cluster. Look again at the two great famine waves we walked through. The catastrophe of the 1870s, and then, barely 2 decades later, another powerful El Niño driving another wave of synchronized famine across many of the same regions in the late 1890s. That is not one disaster. That is a rhythm. The Pacific does not throw its switch a single time and then retire. It throws it on a cycle, warm phase, cool phase, warm phase again, every few years, with the strong events arriving on a longer, looser beat measured in decades. The ocean has a heartbeat, and every so often, that heartbeat delivers one of the big ones. Think of it like a tide inside a tide. There is the short cycle, the ordinary back and forth between warm and cool phases that plays out over a handful of years, and riding on top of that there is a slower swell, a longer rhythm in which the ocean seems to become more prone to producing the truly powerful events for a stretch of years, and then less prone for a stretch after. When the short cycle and the long swell line up, when a strong El Niño fires during a period when the ocean is already leaning toward extremes, that is when you get the events that make it into the history books, or that would have if anyone had understood them well enough to write them down correctly. Here is why that rhythm matters for you tonight, and not just as a piece of trivia about the past. The people of 1876 experienced their catastrophe as a bolt from the blue, a one-time act of a cruel or indifferent sky. They had no way of knowing it was part of a cycle, that another one was coming within a generation, that the ocean was not finished. We do know. We know these events return. We know they cluster. We know the machinery is not a historical curiosity, but an ongoing, repeating feature of the planet we live on right now. Which means every strong event that develops is not just a threat in itself. It is also a reminder that the next one is already scheduled somewhere out in the coming years, whether or not this particular one becomes a monster. And now layer the warmer baseline back on top of that rhythm, because this is where it becomes genuinely serious. It is not just that the events return, it is that each time one returns now, it returns into a world that is a little warmer than the last time it came. The baseline is not holding still between events, it is climbing. So the rhythm of return is not a flat repeating drumbeat. It is a drumbeat that gets a little louder each time because the stage it plays on keeps getting hotter. The El Niño of the next strong cycle will not arrive into the world of this one. It will arrive into a warmer one still. Each turn of the wheel loads the next turn a little more heavily. Let me be precise about what this means, because it is easy to hear it as abstract, and it is not abstract at all. It means that the question is not really, will this specific event be the catastrophic one? The question is broader and heavier than that. It is, are we going to learn to take this pattern seriously, the whole pattern, the returning, clustering, baseline climbing pattern, before one of its turns lands hard enough to force the lesson on us? Because the pattern is going to keep returning regardless. The only variable is whether we meet each return prepared, having built margin during the quiet stretches, or whether we meet each one flat-footed, surprised again, asking again how come nobody told us. The ocean has a memory longer than ours. It has been running this rhythm for as long as there has been a tropical Pacific, and it will run it long after every person watching this is gone. The rhythm is not the threat. The rhythm is just physics. The threat is our habit of forgetting between the beats, of letting each quiet stretch lull us back into the comfortable story so that every strong return finds us as unready as the last one. The atmosphere keeps perfect time. It is our memory that skips. So do not file this away as the story of one ocean event in one particular year. File it as what it actually is, an introduction to a permanent feature of the planet you live on, one that has killed on an almost unimaginable scale before, that returns on a rhythm, that is loading a little heavier with every turn, and that we, uniquely in all of history, have finally been given the tools to see coming. I want to return now to the sentence I opened with, because I think it means something different to you than it did an hour and a half ago. The last time the sky did what it is doing right now, a nation starved. When I said it at the start, it was just a shock, a number, an amnesia, a hook to make you stay. Now you understand the machinery underneath it. You know how a warm patch of the Pacific reaches up into the winds and reroutes the rain for a third of the human species. You know how that rerouting emptied the sky over India and China and Brazil in the same window, and killed on a scale that outstrips the wars we build monuments to. You know why almost no one remembers it. Because it fell on the powerless. Because it arrived as a fade instead of an explosion. And because the people living through it could not see the ocean that was doing it to them. And you know the one thing that makes us different from them. We can see it. The blindfold is off. So here is the harder truth I have been circling all night, and I will say it plainly now that you have the whole picture. The danger was never really the ocean. The ocean is just physics. It warms, it releases, it rearranges the sky. It has done this for as long as there has been a Pacific, and it will do it long after we are gone. The ocean is not cruel. It is not plotting. It does not care about our borders, our harvests, our markets, or our comfort. It simply does what warm water does. The atmosphere does not wait for our consensus. The Pacific does not consult our calendar. The danger was always us. The danger was always what human systems do with the shortage the ocean creates. In 1876, the sky pulled the trigger, but the death toll was written by human choices, by grain shipped away from starving people, by relief withheld on principle, by a world that could not see the event whole and so could not respond to it as one. The atmosphere created the scarcity. We decided who it killed. That is the pattern that repeats. That is the pattern that is available to repeat again. And that is why the comforting version, "It's just a bad year, it'll break," someone would tell us, is not just wrong. It is the specific mistake that turns a survivable event into a catastrophic one. Every civilization that suffered one of these events had somewhere in it the information to say this looks like the last time. What they lacked was not data. It was the will to treat a quiet warning as seriously as a loud one. The gap that kills is not ignorance. It is the comfortable refusal to look at a danger that does not yet look dangerous. You have spent the last 90 minutes refusing that refusal. You looked at the fade while it was still a fade. That by itself is rare, and it is not nothing. Most people will not do it. Most people are waiting for the dramatic moment. The moment that, for this kind of threat, only ever arrives after the window is already closed. So when you hear in the weeks ahead that an El Niño has strengthened, or that a monsoon has arrived late, or that a distant harvest has come in short, and the news reports each one as its own small separate story on its own quiet night, you will know better. You will see the thread the reports do not draw. You will see the ocean underneath, and you will remember the thing that the most terrifying disasters have always had in common. They did not announce themselves. They did not look like the end while there was still time to prevent the end. The people who lived through the beginning of them mistook the beginning for an ordinary year. The catastrophe, when the histories finally recorded it, turned out not to have been the climax anyone was waiting for. It turned out to have been the prologue. So we come, at last, to the fork. And I want to lay both paths in front of you honestly, because the entire reason I made this, the entire reason this channel exists, is that this fork is real, and which path we take is not yet decided. Down one path, the pattern assembles, the way it has before. The subsurface fuel is there, the winds cooperate, the atmosphere couples to the warm ocean and locks in, the event grows into one of the strong ones, and it walks onto a warmer, tighter, more crowded stage than any of its predecessors, and it presses on a global food system with margins thinner than almost anyone admits. And then the second half of the pattern, the human half, plays out the way it always has. The warnings are available but treated as background noise. The window opens and closes with little done inside it. Reserves are not built. Water is not managed. Supply chains are not braced. And the shortage the ocean created becomes a crisis, not because the shortage was unsurvivable, but because we chose, one comfortable day at a time, not to look at it until it was undeniable. That is the path of 1876. It is the path of the Dust Bowl. It is the well-worn path, and it is well-worn precisely because it is the easy one, the one you get by default, by doing nothing, by waiting for a dramatic moment that arrives too late. Down the other path, something almost unprecedented in the history of these events happens. We use the thing our ancestors never had. We use the warning. The instruments light up, and instead of sliding off the surface of public attention, the signal is taken seriously while it is still just a signal. The window opens, and inside it, quiet, unglamorous, undramatic work gets done. Reserves get built. Water gets managed as if the drought might deepen. Supply chains get slack. Households build a little margin. And the same ocean, throwing the same switch, produces a hard year instead of a catastrophic one. Because the difference between those two outcomes was never the ocean. It was always the preparation. It was always the choice made in the months between the warning and the peak. Here is what I need you to understand about those two paths. The ocean does not choose between them. The ocean has already done its part. It is warming, it is releasing, it is beginning to rearrange the sky, and nothing any of us does will change the water this cycle. The choice between the two futures is not made in the Pacific. It is made on land. It is made in the response. It is made by whether the warning is heeded or waved away, which means the most important variable in this entire planetary system is not a temperature, it is a decision, and that decision is still, right now, tonight, entirely in human hands. That is the strange and almost hopeful thing buried at the bottom of a story this dark. The people of 1876 had no choice, because they had no sight. We have both. The blindfold that doomed them has been lifted off of us. We are the first generation in the entire history of this pattern that can watch the switch flip in advance and decide deliberately what to do about it. That is an extraordinary inheritance. The only question that has ever mattered in any of these events, is whether we will use it or whether we will set it down and reach again for the comfortable story and let the fade become a cliff one more time. The forecast is the easy part. It is arriving right on schedule the way it always does now. The preparation is the hard part, and the preparation is a choice. We are going to keep watching this one. That is what this channel is for, to sit with the slow, quiet, planet-scale stories that do not get the time they deserve on a fast news cycle, and to follow them patiently, honestly, for as long as they take to unfold. When the ocean gives us something real to report, a shift in the subsurface, a change in the winds, a coupling in the atmosphere, we will come back and we will walk through it together, calmly, with the whole board in view. For tonight, though, there is nothing left for you to do but understand, and you have already done that. You came in an hour and a half ago believing maybe that famine was a thing of history books and distant places. You leave knowing that it was, and has always been, a thing of the ocean and the sky, and the choices we make underneath them, and that the same machinery is turning again, out over the Pacific, in the dark, while most of the world sleeps through it. But knowing is not the same as fearing, and I do not want to leave you afraid. Fear is a bad companion for a long night, and a worse one for a slow crisis. What I want to leave you with instead is something quieter and steadier. You looked at the thing directly. You understand the mechanism now, the history, the stakes, and the fork. You are, tonight, one of the small number of people who is actually watching the fade while it is still a fade. That is not a reason to lie awake. It is a reason to rest easier, because the worst position in any of these events was never awareness. It was the surprise of the people who never saw it coming. You saw it coming. So let that be enough for tonight. The instruments are still listening out over the Pacific. The buoys are still reporting from beneath the waves. The satellites are still watching the temperature of the water patiently through the dark, whether anyone is awake to read them or not. Nothing needs your worry tonight. The ocean will do what the ocean does, on its own slow schedule, and we will be here to watch it and to tell you plainly when there is something real to tell. So settle in, let the sound carry you down. Stay curious, stay steady, and stay prepared. Not out of fear, but out of the calm, quiet readiness of someone who has looked at the warning and decided not to look away. The atmosphere does not wait for our consensus, but tonight at least, it does not need anything from you at all. Rest easy. We will keep watching the water. If these long, quiet deep dives are the kind of thing that helps you think, or helps you sleep, you know what to do with the subscribe button. We will see you on the next one.